Okay, for the next conversation, we want to show the government how money should be cut from trees. Because it just wants to spend the money. Chop money, chop
Don't
money.
be chopping it
You
anyhow.
are government. Chop money. No. There's no money. First of all, Kenyan said, we are not comfortable raising an extra 340 whatever billion shillings that the government you're looking for many reasons. But one of the main reasons that I heard Kenyan saying is, we don't like how you're spending the money. Can you just cut back? Government said, okay, sawa, we are going to cut back. A supplementary budget was sent to Parliament to review the budget that was there. The Budget and Appropriations Committee of the National Assembly has looked at it, went to the House and said, yeah, here are things here and there. Parliament is still considering it, and the budget is still coming down to 3 point. They've reduced by 200 billion. What do those numbers reveal? We have invited business journalist Ramah Nyang to come and join us for that conversation. Ramah, how you doing?
Very well, very well.
Very good to see you, man.
Tunachapa kidogo na baridi, but it's July weather.
Yeah.
It's a boon for Kenyan coffee farmers and tea farmers.
Yeah.
Just get out there and, support your local Kenyan farmer.
Lakini Ramah, si ununue kofia bwana.
I'm going to CT.
In this July weather, please, Ramah.
No. Listen. Some genetic problems cannot be fixed by random augmentation.
Hata kofia isaidi.
For who?
What?
Inauma lakini unazoea.
Okay.
Yes.
Kibarangoto Kidon. What is that song by BN? Anyway.
In his words, bold men love better. I'm just saying.
All right.
Love who better? Okay, sorry.
Right. City. Please give Ramah one of your please give Ramah the day's proverb.
Yeah, this one might help him. Yes, our proverbs for this week from the Republic of Burundi, which has a population of around 11.8 million people. We mentioned billion in this country so often. I was about to say 11 billion. I realized that can't be true. It's 11 million. Where there is no jealousy, a small hair's leather is enough to cover 4 people.
Where there is no jealousy, a small hair's leather, kakasungura, is enough to cover 4 people.
Yes.
Your interpretation, Ramah?
Well, when people are not trying to hoard resources, the little that we have can go a very long way.
How very appropriate.
See? You picked the right proverb for Ramah.
Kabisa.
Completely.
When you're not trying to say that we have to spend money on random things that the courts have declared illegal, there's money. You can go around and do other things.
I couldn't agree with you more. There actually is money. In fact, the opulence that you see is what tells you there is money.
For frivolous things like health and education.
The important investments.
Yeah.
The important investments that tend to just get swept under the rug. And unfortunately, looking at what MPs have essentially been debating and even what the Budget and Appropriations Committee recommended in terms of cuts, the general outline, the easiest way of summing up what has happened in the last couple of weeks is that politicians still just don't get it.
They don't.
They don't.
Get what?
They don't understand that we're in a fiscally constrained environment. They don't understand that you had your period of time to run around, waste money, make dodgy expenditure decisions, approve dodgy expenditure decisions, some of which essentially fly in the face of court rulings. And remember, these are the same individuals who tell us how we are strong adherents to the rule of law. And we are fantastic stewards of public resources. But just on their own little tests, right? If you essentially say, do you pass the Matthew 25, chapter 25, verse 14 test of being an excellent steward of people's resources, they fail it. They fail it so badly they're worse than the third servant who buried 3 or 5 talents in the ground. Because...
That's why he buried it. He didn't want to lose it. So he buried
it was for safekeeping.
That one at least, was investing, quote unquote. You could essentially make the argument that he was trying to preserve capital. This is capital destruction.
Completely.
Yeah.
Where are we, Ramah, in terms of process?
Yeah.
Where are we? We know President said, okay, we've got to cut our spending. Treasury took proposals to Parliament.
Yes.
Where are we now?
Okay. Treasury takes those proposals to Parliament. Budget and Appropriations Committee looks at them and says, okay, let's have public hearings. Let's hear from Eric. Let's hear from Lou. Let's hear from CT. We all pile in and we say, well, we think you should cut X. We think you should cut Y. 23rd of July, parliamentarians come back to the House. The Budget and Appropriations Committee then turns around and says, okay, this is the feedback that we got from the public. These are the things that we think should happen. So one of the things that they essentially did is, it's essentially on both sides of the equation. So on the tax side, they essentially said, look, we think that some of the forecasts that are coming out from National Treasury with respect to revenue forecasts are just way too optimistic. And they essentially are looking at a cut in tax revenue, at least based on the forecast that Treasury submitted for this financial year, by about 268.5 billion shillings. And the biggest cut there is actually on excise taxes. So they assume that those targets are going to be missed by about 104.
What was the target?
104 billion.
In total.
The original one was 2.9 trillion. But even that 2.9 trillion Kenyan shillings target is wildly optimistic, because remember, for the last fiscal year, the target was about 2.7 originally, 2.7. They revised it much later when they brought the supplementary budget to the floor of the House. But that problem that has always existed with the way we tend to deal with revenue forecasting in the country is still very prevalent. Start of the fiscal year, we'll say, we'll be fine. We'll
Find it.
We'll find $25 billion. What's your problem? And then we get halfway through the financial year and we're like, actually,
maybe not.
Yeah, we're not going to raise that kind of money. Then we have to cut. But you see, by that point in time, because
you've committed money.
Exactly, because your spending plan was already based on that 2.7 trillion revenue target. So when you miss that, your deficit goes up, so you end up borrowing a lot more. So with respect to where we now, the report has been tabled in the House. It's been debated. The supplementary appropriations bill is out. MPs have to get their hands into that. And at some point, obviously, you have to go through the processes, debate that, take it to the House on the Hill, it gets signed. So hopefully that cuts spending.
So, Ramah, we hear from different sectors already that there's complaints that, certain things cannot happen. We've heard it from the health sector. We've heard it from education. We've heard it already from even at county level, that because of the decline to assent to the finance bill, which would have essentially activated tax mechanisms then to raise this revenue, that then certain things now cannot happen. And that's the reason that we're being given for a lot of things now, that there's going to be a whole chunk of revenue that will not then be available. Does that contribute to some of the things that you've said now? There's 104 billion not there. Certain things cannot now be done because essentially there is no finance. It's a reason that's being given. President has said it on a number of occasions since June.
The president, unfortunately, well, and it's not just him, but the president and a whole bunch of other people in government are using that as a distraction because they're fundamentally misdiagnosing the problem. If you say that, and this is a crude example, but if I, as an individual in my household, I say I'm going to spend 800,000 shillings in the month of August, but I know that historically, best case revenue that I've managed to raise is 400k, 500k, and then I turn to you and say, "Hey, look, I can't take you to Malaysia."
Sad.
In September, because
I was hoping to have 800.
Yeah, I was hoping to have 800, but I don't have the money. And in fact, not only do I not have the 800, I'm barely making that 300 or 400 that I historically made. I am fundamentally misdiagnosing the situation. Because remember, if you actually step back and ask, and we take a look at the spending plan for the original spending plan for this financial year, one of the underlying assumptions that Treasury had penciled in, and this is pre the anti-finance bill protests, was that we would have a near 19% increase in tax revenue from last fiscal year to this fiscal year. So you move from that jump of 19% to 2.9 trillion shillings in tax revenue. Now, 2.9 trillion shillings in tax revenue based on what consumption? Companies are barely hiring. companies in some cases are downsizing. Consumer spending has basically hit a brick wall. It's fallen off a cliff in some cases. You're seeing households are reducing spending. Companies are doing the exact same thing. Now, in that sort of environment, you cannot then ultimately say that you're going to be able to raise an extra 19% in revenue. Where is it going to come from? Right? There's a whole bunch of things that were incoherent from the start. So for politicians to then turn around and say, oh, we can't do X, we can't do Y, we can't do Z, there's also, you can actually take that fib a step further. Because, for example, if you look at the arguments that the Committee on Health was making when they were talking about these reductions, and they say, look, the allocation for recruitment of medical interns is 3.7 billion and the requirement is 5.2 billion to essentially get these individuals into the public workforce. And they say we are facing a shortfall of 1.5 billion. Okay, fair enough. Now, you can sit back and ask, where can I find 1.5 billion without raising tax revenue? There's got to be other places, right, in public expenditure where I can find that kind of money.
Yeah.
And anyone could look at the line budgets in State House and say, hang on, I could take the 560 odd million shillings from the office of the First Lady. I could take, no, actually it was closer to 600, roughly 600 between the offices of the First and the Second Lady. It's 1.2 billion. Now, strictly speaking, as a math exercise, because economics and public policy is really about trying to maximize the benefits that we have to the greatest number of people.
Yeah.
What is the greatest possible return that we can have for this 1.2 billion? Is it spending it on these two offices, which, let's be honest, duplicate a whole lot of other functions that are being done in government and are not necessarily needed in the larger scheme of things, versus saying we want to deliver better healthcare to our employees, to our employers, because strictly speaking, the taxpayer is our employer. We want to deliver better healthcare outcomes to our employers. So let's take this 1.2 billion out of this and put it into healthcare. There's a whole bunch of decisions that MPs basically just flaked out on, and that's one of them.
So from the final figures that we've seen, from what's currently now being looked at in Parliament, what are those numbers telling us? Well, the first thing that you told us is that they're not getting it.
Yeah.
Okay, now break it down. They're not getting it, for example.
Okay, so I've given you the example on healthcare.
On health. And this is a practical example.
That's a practical example.
So right now, the allocation to the health ministry, and this would have gone directly for training, and this is for sending medical interns to our facilities for 1 year, has a shortfall of 1.5 billion shillings.
Yeah, that's essentially what they told that's what the health committee told the budget and appropriations committee.
Is this after the reduction, or was it even before the reduction?
That was after the reduction.
So this is so the National Treasury went back to Parliament and said, let's cut this.
Yes.
Let's actually reduce the money that we're going to use to send these medical interns across the country.
Pretty much.
To serve 1 year so they can become fully registered as doctors.
Yeah.
And it's a requirement of our laws. The Treasury said that.
Pretty much.
Okay. Give us another example.
So there's a whole bunch of others. I mean, you can sit back and ask yourself, okay, we have all this cash that we say we want to spend. Housing is another interesting one, and there's a whole other conversation to be had about how willing politicians are to take an axe to their pet projects or not. And in this instance, if you read this report, it basically tells you they're not willing to do a lot of those things. So, for instance, State Department for Housing, housing levy, deeply contentious thing. And it's a policy position that I completely disagree with on multiple levels. The assumption that they were making was that, look, we might be able to raise about 63.2 billion Kenyan shillings from the housing levy, but they actually revised that number higher for this fiscal year to 72 billion. The Affordable Housing Fund had a balance of nearly 40 billion by end June. Okay.
Had meaning within their coffers.
Already contributed,
yes.
already collected.
Yes. So if I look at your account of the Affordable Housing Fund,
40 billion.
You've got nearly 40 billion just sitting there. Just sitting there.
Right.
Now, the counter argument they will make is, this is just routine cash flow management. Yes, we'll be collecting this money on a regular basis, but it's not always going to be going out to
At the same.
at the same pace, right? So in the meantime, it has to be parked somewhere, reinvest it in treasury bills, reinvest it in treasury bonds, that sort of thing. But if you then look at the actual allocation, or rather the spending outlay that the State Department for Housing has, there's an interesting gap that shows up there to the tune of around 40 or so odd billion shillings. And one of the questions that analysts have been asking is, hang on a minute, if you're already forecasting that you're going to be able to raise 72 billion through the affordable housing levy, but your total spend is going to be something in the order of 110, are we looking at another increase?
Spend for what?
If you're the State Department for Housing,
Yeah.
right? You're essentially saying I'm going to be able to spend 110 billion.
To do what?
To do what? Whatever it is.
Affordable
Projects.
housing.
Is it just affordable housing, or is it including, urban development and all those other things?
Affordable housing.
Okay.
So now if you're going to say you're going to do all those things, but your revenue target, the gap between what your revenue target is and what you want to spend is in the order of almost 40 billion shillings. Where's that extra cash coming from?
Chief said there's 40 billion in the account.
No. Because remember, that might already have been committed to other projects.
Had it?
We do not know. Because that comes back to the question around the quality of data that we're actually getting from the government. Is it transparent and detailed and granular enough to actually say, we have this much in hand, this is what has been committed to project XYZ, and this is what we're targeting for the next financial year. Right? There's a lot of question marks that you can essentially point out there. But if you essentially just look at purely, this is what we plan to spend versus this is what we think we'll be able to raise, that 40 billion shilling gap there has a lot of questions.
Ramah, something happened in the Kibaki era. For a year, we are informed that there were no new development projects. As a person who understands these things infinitely better than I do, what was the purpose of this? What was the late president trying to do? Well, why did he say stop?
Okay, so a couple of things. One, a lot of those development projects, and I believe this is pre the Public Finance Management Act, you're going to have to fund a lot of those through debt. So in some cases, you might already have committed to raising X amount of money to build a road, build a dam, whatever the case might be. So for the stuff that you haven't already committed cash for, that you haven't raised for, you've said, look, I want to build a road for the sake of argument, let's say I want to build a subway.
Yes.
From one end of Nairobi to the next. I know it might cost me 40 billion shillings, hypothetically. Now, I will put that into the budget and I'll try and raise that money at some point. But if it's not committed already, I haven't raised the cash, I haven't found a contractor, I've not done a feasibility study, I have no business putting it into the budget. Get rid of it. Stop. So that's one. Because all that then does is it gives you clarity on these are the projects that are already committed and they're funded.
Yep.
These are the projects that we'd like to do, but we don't have the money for this. And these are the projects that we're still in negotiations around on financing. But the second issue is this. If you think about the places where an enormous amount of money gets lost or wasted or just really badly spent, big chunks of it tend to be in the procurement space. Right? And you see that pretty much everywhere. You can look at audit reports of Kenya Railways and they will say, look, we're questioning whether or not we actually got value for money in how the SGR was constructed. And you can essentially go all the way down to CDF reports and you'll find individuals who say they spent 400,000 shillings building what on paper should have been a four-door pit latrine, but you end up with a 3-door pit latrine and then the walls have got cracks, so it's essentially unsafe to use.
It's a single mud-walled pit latrine.
Suba South accounts for the fiscal year, for the 2021-2022 fiscal year. That's the example that I actually have in mind. So there's all of that nonsense that goes on left and right. So in his case, it would make a lot of sense to say, hey, guys, stop.
Don't put it in the books.
Yeah, don't put it in the books. Let's bring everything to a stop. And that idea was pitched repeatedly Because if you look at some of the public submissions that were made to the Budget and Appropriations Committee, there were individuals who just said point blank, we can't be spending this kind of money. Right? And it was on everything from defense to, there were questions around why is it that you have a research and policy unit in the office of the president, and yet we have treasury. Right? Why are you duplicating these two roles? And you could make the exact same argument around the affordable housing program. You've got KMRC, which is trying to make it a lot easier for people to get mortgages.
Exactly.
Right? And to their credit, Johnson Austerity and his team have been really marketing that product hard. Because now I'm at a stage where a lot of us, if you go to our SACCO, you go to our banks, they'll tell you, we'll lend to you 20 years, 8%, 20 years, 9%. I'm at an age where, you have these conversations with your parents and they'll tell you, I took my first mortgage and it was at 28%.
Yeah.
Right? There's a big delta there. So you have KMRC that's trying to make mortgages a lot more affordable. You've got the National Housing Corporation, which is older than the country itself, because it was set up by the Brits when we were still a colony. That's essentially been trying to build houses. And then you sit back and you think, no, let's compound the problem. Let's bring in this liquidity trap and say affordable housing. And it's going to cost us the better part of 100 billion a year. Like, why? So, in short, politicians still don't get it.
Our guest this morning is Ramah Nyang, a business journalist. He's here. We're talking about the government austerity measures. What are the numbers revealing? The numbers are before Parliament right now. The National Assembly is looking at the supplementary budget that's been presented to it. The Budget and Appropriations Committee of the National Assembly has already presented its report. So MPs are now to make a decision on where the cuts are going to be and some areas which they will not touch, according to Ramah. You can just see that they're not willing to touch them. And maybe then they will end up touching areas that affect us directly in terms of service delivery. So Ramah, let's look at the areas where, there is proper expectation of service delivery and better service delivery.
Yeah.
Education. We've been having issues with education from basic education all the way to higher education for a while now on funding. Health and healthcare. Health is devolved, so money going to counties, and also health at national level. Vaccinations, we have been having issues with vaccines and access to vaccines, doctors and doctor packages, all right? And such other services. Are they affected by the proposed budget cuts?
By and large. So if you essentially just go through like some of the highlights of what the Education Committee was talking about when they were essentially making the submissions to the Budget and Appropriations Committee, there's a whole bunch of things that they said they would essentially struggle to cope with. So 5.1 billion out. And they say that's going to cripple the ability of the country to run its national examinations. And there's 2 million, I believe, learners who are registered to take exams somewhere in the course of the year. There was a 10 billion shilling reduction for the TSC for implementation of the CBA with teachers. They say that's going to be jeopardized by all of this. And the proposal to shift the school feeding program for the education sector could disrupt its effectiveness. They say in supporting retention, completion rates, and school attendance. And there's merit to saying all of that. I think the question that some may come up with in response is, okay, but how much questionable expenditure is there within the education ministry? Because if the pattern that we're seeing elsewhere is one of consistent waste, then it is entirely possible that
there's also waste here.
There's also waste there.
Why do we need to spend billions of shillings to manage a grade 6 exam?
True. Actually, the question one would ask is, even if you do the maths, all these monies that are allocated to education, and we take pride in it being one of the biggest budget item we have, is all that money actually necessary? Because this is a question that I haven't heard asked very often. We just take it that it's not enough. Okay, fine. This amount of money, take whatever it is, and look at the needs that we have. Because against this need, we have schools which don't exist, and yet they seem to be registered and they receive money.
Children that don't exist
and yet they receive money.
Entire schools,
Entire schools that are supposed to exist, and yet they do not actually exist.
And even if we say for the sake of argument, there's a couple of ways of looking at it, because education needs are met by both private capital and capital sourced in the private sector. In the public sector. But to the extent that you've already decimated through unpredictable tax policy. You keep changing tax policy or elements of the Income Tax, the Excess Tax Act, the VAT Act, year after year after year. So you've effectively made the country hostile to investment. So incomes have been decimated. Companies are not hiring. Companies are not paying people. Parents are already going to struggle, right, to take their kids to school. They'll still do it. We'll still prioritize educating our kids, but it'll be a struggle.
Yeah.
But on the other side of the equation, money simply can't just be allocated left and right on the assumption that there's some sort of magical pot of gold at the end of some rainbow that only government has access to. Because sometimes this is how exactly government seems to be behaving.
And even not just access to, they're the ones who have an understanding of it. I mean, the same question goes to money that is allocated to the counties. It's always not enough. And yet the Auditor General's report always tells us of monies that can't fully be explained, expenditures that can't fully be... And it's not small change, okay? And aside from that, even when we are told that there's justification for the money having been used, in the years we've had devolution, that money, if we just take it at face value, that money has been used for what we are told it was. The changes would have in our counties would be immense.
Actually, there's an interesting tangent that you're setting me on there. Because, again, the Budget and Appropriations Committee kept saying, we can't cut spending on XYZ because it would compromise service delivery, right? If that's the case, why are you still allocating money to the Constituency Development Fund, and yet that same CDF was very clearly stated by the Supreme Court in August 2022 to be illegal?
They circumvented that with law and called it the National Government Constituency Development Fund.
Yes.
So it's not a parliament fund, it's just national government running its development project,
and ultimately
at constituency level.
At constituency
and that's why
level,
the MP is not involved.
Right.
It's a constituency,
which is a fib. It's like painting a donkey with white stripes and black paint,
calling it a zebra,
and then call it a zebra. Behold, this is not a donkey anymore. It's now a zebra.
Is that then not?
Still, I'm sure. Is
that not the notion? Then the question that must be applied for anything that speaks of expenditure from a body, from the government, from the county government. Does it not? Because, yes, the auditor, focus, the Auditor General's reports, just the queries that keep coming up and that we hear about. Now, what about the ones we don't hear about and never feature?
Like the ones that are never delivered on time?
Yes.
Ramah, though the principle may be the same, is it possible for us to compare government or nations, for example, to a household, whereby you say that, look, this is what it looked like. I mean, kind of like what we did with 800,000 shillings, whatever.
Yeah.
Is it that we were all right, but certain factors then are contributing to us not being all right. We can't do things the way in which we used to do them before. Luxury has to be chucked out the window, or at least reduced significantly. But can you say, are there nations, do we have examples of how you say we have got to apply austerity, we have got to make sure that there are policies, economic policies that ensure growth. You've got to make sure that there are certain principles you put in place that ensures as well that a country now is operating at surplus, which is the only way you will develop. Is it possible to actually see and say these are ways in which it can actually be done with what you have?
The one comparison, and it's a slightly unfair one because I'm essentially comparing a much more developed economy to us. But in the 90s, Bill Clinton managed to actually turn a surplus quite a few times, right? And this is the largest economy in the planet. You managed to essentially turn a surplus, budget surpluses rather, for quite a few years consecutively. So it is entirely possible to both have pro-growth policies, but at the same time not essentially have a complete blowout of public expenditure, or to have completely unfunded spending, which unfortunately is by and large what the Kenyan government has been doing for a fairly long period of time. We essentially do it, in contrast to the household example that I gave you, where you say, okay, I actually have X amount of money, and if I want to go beyond this budget, I've got to borrow, right, to make up that difference. Because governments can essentially raise their money either through taxes or borrowing, arguably ad infinitum. So states essentially have access to a much bigger pool of resources than your typical household would. But the problem with doing that, because say for example, if you're your insurance company or you're a bank, and you're looking for a place to essentially park capital, get a decent return on it. It's not something insane, but we're preserving capital and we're getting a decent return. More often than not, the only game in town, especially now, because private sector credit growth has essentially dived off a cliff. It was 6.6% at the last, I think in April, going by the numbers that the governor used last time. Where are you going to essentially park the cash? Are you going to lend it to me in the media space where you're not sure if I'll have a job tomorrow? Or are you going to lend it to government or short term at 16%? Right?
Government straight.
Exactly. So in that sense, because government knows they have that market cornered, they have access to this captive pool of capital within the domestic market. There's certain things that sort of influences the way in which they end up spending our money and borrowing on our account.
Right.
But it is possible.
With what Kenya has today, because it's not like it's not 2 coins left in treasury, right? And we can see that they spend happening.
Yeah.
Right? With what the current situation, is it possible to pull strings here and there and say it's going to be tight for the next 5 years or however long things like this take, but that it is possible to have real discipline, economic, fiscal discipline, and say we'll be responsible? Because if we don't see that it can be possible, then it sounds like a merry-go-round. It's just going to continue for
Where
forever.
Would you start, if I may ask, in your mind, because I like the trajectory you've taken, where would the discipline begin?
Well, I mean, for me, just this, I mean, what do you do? I mean, I keep going back to the household because it makes sense in terms of a micro example that you can give and then, put it on a larger scale.
Because,
is that you get rid of luxury first. You get rid of luxury first, things that you absolutely can't survive without.
Let's look at an example. Let's say, okay, a household, like you said.
Yeah.
So in this household, it's, man, wife, and a child. And the child is in school. You live in a house, 100K rent, say school fees per term is 80,000 shillings. Say you have a car, there's a car loan, you're fueling the car, 25K a month. There's a car loan that you're paying 50K a month. There's domestic expenditures as shopping for domestic, there's 30K a month. There's the father's entertainment allowance, gives himself 20K a month. All those kind of things, right? And then you face this kind of now financial challenge and you've got to go into austerity. And the first decision that the father makes is, let's remove this child from this school and take them to a 40K school.
As opposed
from 80K school to 40K school, but you still stay in the 100K rent.
And have your 25,000 entertainment
allowance. In fact, let's also reduce our we are cooling too many nyama, we are eating too many. Let's reduce the domestic shopping from 30K to 15K, but my entertainment allowance stays
intact.
And we still have to stay in this house that we are paying 100K. And
why don't you just buy a new car while you're at it?
It's actually worse than that, because it's like me walking around these streets of Nairobi, and I know I owe you, Eric. I owe you 100 Gs. And when you call me, mteja nambari hapatikani, this person cannot be found. But then you look at my Instagram account, and you see me at some random lounge somewhere, washing my hands with 10K booties of Johnny Walker. You're going to be like, dude, austerity where?
Yeah.
Right? Because essentially that's where we are. The Kenyan government is behaving like that guy who's basically buying 10K booties of Johnny Walker and washing his hands with them.
You asked the question, the state of California, famous, 2 years ago, had a surplus of $100 billion. Something else was happening, though. The revenue was dwindling. The fathers of that particular state continued spending. As we speak now, as of March 24th, around then, they now, from $100 billion surplus, they now had a $73 billion deficit. Okay, so now, our collections are dwindling. Clear, we can see.
Yeah.
Our expenditure is not dwindling. The indicator that you need to do things differently is usually simply the household rule. How much money do we have? What don't we need? Because when you have more money, there's conspicuous consumption.
Yeah.
Okay? What don't you need?
And
Yes.
what must we try as much as possible to preserve?
Yes.
You know, as we are, what is essential, what is excess baggage? So first of all, cut off the fat until you get to the bone, and then you say, all right, so in these bones, maybe I can
Make soup.
slice
And
one.
unfortunately, we don't. And this another example of just how MPs don't get it, right? Because there was a proposal. If you look at Parliament's budget, it's something the order of 44 odd billion shillings. And one of the proposals that was made to the committee was they were told, you guys need to cut your spending in half. And we've heard it before. You know, the MPs will say that they look at the amount of money that's been loaded onto their official cars for using this expressway. It's a ridiculous amount of money. There is no rational reason that I can think of to be paying someone the better part of 800,000 shillings a month. And then on top of that, I'm giving you a communications allowance, quote unquote, of almost 20,000 shillings a month. That's the same 20,000 shillings that I can use to be paying
Two
someone.
ECD teachers. Two.
Yeah.
Two.
Priorities.
What's important, what's not?
Yeah.
That salary is supposed to cover all those things, is it not?
One would think.
Ideally, but if you think about it, you know, they're throwing. Why am I giving you access to a single-digit mortgage, right? When you're in Parliament, and the housing allowance at the same time,
Yeah, we've forgotten about the vehicle.
all those things. But MPs basically sat down and said, well, actually, the cost of running Parliament currently is more than the proposed 20 billion. Parliament's budget has been rationalized. We have made cuts to the tune of 3.7 billion. The committee has taken note of these views, and the allocation should be reviewed on a need basis.
That and they've shown in the middle finger.
This is a very polite way, using very many words, of just saying, yeah, we're not really going to cut anything.
Yeah.
We are not willing to take any serious amount of pain to actually reflect the fact that we're operating on a much smaller resource envelope. And the thing that is now becoming a much graver concern, because it's a conversation that's now coming up a lot more often in policy circles, is politicians have repeatedly shown that they don't get it at all. They don't understand the resource constraints we're in. B, they seem to think that the party can just keep going on. And if you're in a situation where you're spending 5 or 6 out of every 10 shillings that you're raising in tax revenue just on servicing debt, that debt is becoming a lot more expensive, because remember, T-bill costs have gone from 7% to about 16% in the span of less than 2 years, which is incredibly expensive. Your effective income tax base is not growing. You raised you introduced 2 new marginal tax bands on income taxes last year. Your income tax collections didn't go up by much last year. So you effectively hit a brick wall in how much you can raise in tax revenue, but you're not making a serious effort to cut your spending or to reorganize your spending. So the question now that I am facing a lot more often is, when are you guys going to start having serious conversations around restructuring your debt? And that's a painful conversation that eventually, if we maintain this trajectory, it's going to be a very painful conversation to have.
Painful. To ignore what needs to be done or to wait for the sky to fall on our heads, which is more painful?
Well, both will happen. Because right now what we're doing is pretending that we can just keep partying like it's...
Borrowing.
But you're borrowing and you're spending money on all sorts of random things, like all this nonsense that we have with
Yani unaenda kuchukua cooperative loan for sherehe.
Yes. Instead of building a house, instead of investing in a
It's for
business.
Lisa. Where we are at right now, so it's before Parliament.
Yeah.
And, you know, it appears like the public focus has been moved from the budget conversation into everything else, into reconstituting the cabinet, into
Because they're holding those hearings on vetting days.
and all those things. So the public focus is sort of shifting away from that budget conversation that led us to where we got to a point where people said no to the finance bill and extra revenue raising measures.
Correct.
How do we bring that conversation back up? And that's one of the reasons why we invited you today, so we can bring that conversation back to the people and show them, okay, rejection of the finance bill was not an end by itself. There's still a very crucial process here that's going on.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful, we'll just have said, yeah, we cannot raise 346 billion shillings via tax. We're just going to borrow it and then tax you to pay it back.
There's got to be... We still have to keep that pressure up. Because in the same way that we spent a great deal of time and effort trying to explain to people, this is a finance act of the finance bill of 2024. This is how it'll affect you. If you make this specific change to the Excise Duty Act, it means you're going to be spending a lot more money on when you're making payments via M-Pesa, Airtel Money, Telco Money, whatever. If you make this specific change to the VAT Act, this is how it's going to affect you. You're going to be paying more for bread, for diapers, yada, yada, yada. And manufacturers will not be able to remain in business in this specific country, and so on and so forth. And there was a marvelous civic education effort that came up around the tax side of things.
Yeah.
I think we'll need something similar, especially with respect to how much we're spending on XYZ. Because like I said, and I get it, reading through these entire documents can be an absolute pain.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the way it's formatted, like if you look at that budget and Appropriations Committee report, the actual text part of it is probably like 20% of the document. The remainder is just reams and reams and reams of tables saying, this much for this unit, this much for this unit, this much for this unit. So unless you're actually willing to punch that data into an Excel spreadsheet and then do the math and figure out, okay, what's been cut, what's not been cut, it's going to be difficult. And the unfortunate reality is that right now, I do not think that mainstream media is in a position to actually effectively do that job. Because, newsrooms are shrinking right across the board.
Yeah.
And not only a newsroom shrinking, but remember, more often than not, the smallest part of most of these newsrooms tend to be the business desks. You've got people in there who are essentially overworked. You've got 1,000,001 different things that you want to focus on, and especially now we're getting into earnings season. So there's company results coming out left and right. They just don't have the bandwidth to do this.
But citizens have shown us that they actually have the bandwidth.
They do.
And this is what we saw with what you're saying, the civic awareness around the finance bill.
Yeah.
People came out and they started looking at items that were affecting them and coming out and saying, this is what we see. I've seen the same kind of thing, with just looking at audits and what's happened. For example, there's someone on social media on X called Bonnie Mwangi. He's an economist, CPA, and a lawyer. And he has, for example, done something with Mandera County and looking at the expenditures in Mandera County. A very interesting long thread that he did. And you can follow it at Mwangi Bonnie, and Bonnie is BONNIE, Mwangi Bonnie on X. He did one. And this sort of breaks it down, and people start saying, okay, so this is how much money was going into this county. This is how they spent that money. And this is the impact. What basically it means. It means that this is how much you're paying the governor, this is how much you've spent to build a governor's residence, this is how much
that's how we ended up with the Bungoma governor trying to defend spending, 25 million shillings on flowers.
Yes. So we need more and more
of
people just looking at these things.
And the thing that I found interesting, there's a study that was done by Nendo, they're a data analytics firm in the wake of the finance bill protest. And I think that one of the things that stood out for me, and this will, for a lot of our audience, I think probably just say how old I am, was a lot of the conversations around the finance bill. How does this affect you? What's happening? etc. Wasn't actually driven on Twitter.
It was on TikTok.
Yep. Nearly 1 billion impressions on TikTok.
Yep.
So in some ways, clearly for me, I'll admit that's a bit of a blind spot. I need to get back in there. But yeah, we've got to pay attention to it, and because the supplementary appropriation bill is coming back to the floor of the House this afternoon, nice opportunity for people to sit down and say, our MPs are playing us here.
This is it. So the call to action basically is everybody pay attention. It's not over.
It's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
It's not over. The issue of government expenditure and excess expenditure is still not over, and if you don't watch out, it'll still creep back. Ramah, always a pleasure having you.
Asante sana.
Yeah, it's always good having Ramah Nyang is a business journalist. He's been our guest for this last 1 hour, looking at the proposed budget cuts This supplementary budget conversation is coming back to Parliament. It's still in Parliament. If MPs pass it as it is, it's still going to be a reduction, slight reduction to the budget, by about 177 billion shillings, or is it 200 billion?
Yeah, well, let's call it 170.
Okay.
Yeah.
170 billion shillings. Is that enough? And then who gets affected? Does that mean that we don't send our medical interns to the hospitals? 29% of health services are offered by interns. It's a big conversation. Keep it here.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.